ExamPrep.School. Vermont Adjusters Workers' Compensation Insurance Exam, Exam Code Series 14-34. There are 6 practice exams in this series. This video covers Practice Exam 1, which is free. In this video, we will be covering the following major categories for Practice Exam 1. Insurance Regulation, Workers' Compensation Claim Principles, Workers' Compensation Insurance. Let's walk through the format. I'll read each question and its choices. Let's get started. Question 1. Under 8 VSA, Section 4803, subsection A, an applicant for a Vermont Insurance Adjuster license must meet all of the following requirements except A. Be at least 18 years old. B. Complete at least 20 hours of pre-licensing education. C. Furnish proof of a bond or other security in a specified amount. D. Submit evidence of Vermont residency. A countdown circle appears in the top right. Once it completes, the answer is revealed. You can pause at any time if you'd like longer to think. If you'd like additional practice covering more topics, see the description for our book. The correct answer is B. Under 8 VSA, Section 4803, subsection A, applicants must be 18 or older, provide Vermont residency proof, and post the required bond or security. The statute does not mandate pre-licensing education hours. Reason A is not correct. Being at least 18 years old is explicitly required by the statute, so it is not the exception. Reason C is not correct. Providing the specified bond or security is mandated by the statute, so it is not the exception. Reason D is not correct. Proof of Vermont residency is a statutory requirement, making it a valid condition rather than the exception. Question 2. Jordan, a 19-year-old who recently moved to Vermont from New Hampshire, holds an active workers' compensation adjuster license from their previous state and submits an application for a Vermont adjuster license. Jordan has not designated a Vermont resident agent. Which statement correctly describes Jordan's eligibility under Vermont law? A. Jordan meets all requirements because the minimum licensing age is 18, and Vermont honors out-of-state adjuster licenses. B. Jordan will qualify once 6 months of Vermont residency have been established. C. Jordan is currently ineligible because non-resident applicants must designate a resident agent in Vermont before licensure. D. Jordan must be at least 21 years old to apply for an adjuster license in Vermont. The correct answer is C. The correct answer is that non-resident applicants must designate a Vermont resident agent. Without that designation, even though the age and existing license are acceptable, licensure cannot proceed. Reason A is not correct. Reciprocal recognition of out-of-state licenses does not waive the requirement to designate a Vermont resident agent for non-residents. Reason B is not correct. There is no 6-month residency requirement. Instead, non-residents may qualify by appointing a resident agent. Reason D is not correct. The statutory minimum age for an adjuster license in Vermont is 18, not 21. Question 3. Under Vermont's biennial adjuster license renewal date rule, when does a resident adjuster's license expire and require renewal? A. 2 years from the original issue date. B. On the licensee's birthday in the second year after issuance. C. On June 30th of even-numbered calendar years. D. On the last day of the licensee's birth month in the second year after issuance. The correct answer is D. Under Vermont law, an adjuster's license is valid for 2 years and expires on the last day of the licensee's birth month in the second year after issuance, at which point renewal must be completed. Reason A is not correct. Licenses are tied to birth month timing rather than simply 2 years from issue. Reason B is not correct. Expiration is set at the end of the birth month, not specifically on the birthday itself. Reason C is not correct. Expiration is personal to the licensee's birth month, not a fixed calendar date like June 30th. Question 4. Under 8 VSA Section 3661, a cease and desist order issued by the Commissioner becomes operative when which of the following occurs? A. The order has been served on the individual or entity named in the order. B. A notice of the order has been published in the Vermont Register. C. The Commissioner files the order with the Secretary of State. D. The recipient has exhausted all administrative appeals. The correct answer is A. This option is correct because 8 VSA Section 3661 specifies that a cease and desist order takes effect upon service to the person or entity involved. The other options describe procedures not required for the order to become effective under this statute. Reason B is not correct. Publication in the Vermont Register is not required for a cease and desist order to take effect under this statute. Reason C is not correct. Filing with the Secretary of State is not specified as a condition for effectiveness in the statute. Reason D is not correct. Exhaustion of administrative appeals occurs after an order is effective when served, not as a prerequisite. Question 5. Under 21 VSA Section 601, subsection 14, which criterion must be satisfied to classify an individual as an employee under the Vermont Workers' Compensation Act? A. Receiving compensation for personal labor or services performed for an employer. B. Supplying tools and materials to an employer for use in the employer's business. C. Volunteering time without expectation of monetary remuneration. D. Operating an independent business, offering services to multiple clients. The correct answer is A. The correct answer is that an employee must receive remuneration for personal labor or services under the statute. Reason B is not correct. Supplying tools and materials reflects a provider of equipment rather than a paid service performer. Reason C is not correct. Volunteering lacks the element of compensation required for employee status. Reason D is not correct. Operating an independent business denotes contractor status, not employee status. Question 6. Under the Vermont Nature of Business test for independent contractor status, which factor is required? A. Maintaining a separate business that offers services to the general public. B. Performing tasks that fall within the employer's ordinary course of business. C. Receiving a fixed hourly wage from a single hiring entity. D. Working under the direct supervision of the hiring employer. The correct answer is A. The correct answer is that the individual must operate an independently established business offering services to the public. Reason B is not correct. Working within the employer's ordinary operations suggests employee status, not a separate contractor. Reason C is not correct. Receiving a fixed wage from one firm indicates an employment relationship rather than an independent business risk. Reason D is not correct. Direct supervision by the hiring entity conflicts with independent contractor autonomy. Question 7. Under Vermont's statutory employer doctrine for contractors, a principal becomes liable for a contractor's employee if the work performed is A. Part of the principal's trade, business, occupation, or undertaking. B. Carried out with tools and equipment supplied by the contractor. C. Subject to a separate workers' compensation policy held by the contractor. D. Completed under conditions not specified in the original contract. The correct answer is A. The correct answer is that liability attaches when the contractor's work is within the principal's usual trade or undertaking. Reason B is not correct. Provision of tools by the contractor does not trigger statutory employer liability. Reason C is not correct. Having a separate policy pertains to insurance coverage, not the doctrine of liability. Reason D is not correct. Undefined contract conditions are unrelated to the statutory employer criteria. Question 8. Which of the following agricultural workers is exempt from mandatory Vermont workers' compensation coverage under the agricultural exceptions? A. A farmhand paid an annual wage of $1,800 during harvest season. B. A sharecropper compensated solely by a share of the crop yield. C. A greenhouse technician processing produce within a packing facility. D. a hired hand working for a neighboring farm on a day labor basis. The correct answer is B. The correct answer is that sharecroppers paid by a share of the crop are excluded from coverage under the agricultural exception. Reason A is not correct. Seasonal workers paid a wage fall under the payroll test and thus require coverage. Reason C is not correct. Workers in produce processing are not covered by the agricultural exception. Reason D is not correct. Day labor hired hands do not qualify for the sharecropper exception. Question 9. After responding to a mutual aid call at a neighboring town's fire scene, a volunteer firefighter slips on wet ground and breaks an ankle. Under Vermont workers' compensation law, what coverage applies to the resulting medical expenses? A. Expenses are not covered because volunteers do not qualify as statutory employees. B. Expenses are covered as work-related when the volunteer is performing authorized firefighting duties. C. Expenses are covered only if the volunteer's municipality has adopted a specific volunteer coverage ordinance. D. Expenses are capped at a nominal stipend irrespective of actual treatment costs. The correct answer is B. The correct answer is that medical expenses are covered as work-related when the volunteer is performing authorized duties. Because Vermont statutes extend workers' compensation benefits to volunteer firefighters while engaged in official activities. Reason A is not correct. Volunteer firefighters are included in the statutory definition of employees when engaged in official duties, so coverage is not denied. Reason C is not correct. Coverage is not contingent on municipal ordinances. State law provides coverage by default for volunteers on duty. Reason D is not correct. There is no fixed stipend limit for volunteers. Actual medical costs are covered under workers' compensation. Question 10. A Vermont-based commercial truck driver spends most weeks hauling goods through New Hampshire. According to Vermont workers' compensation rules, which state is the driver's principal place of employment for coverage purposes? A. The state where the majority of driving miles are recorded. B. The state where the employment contract was negotiated and signed. C. The state where the driver's home terminal or reporting location is situated. D. The state where the hired vehicles are registered and maintained. The correct answer is C. The correct answer is that the principal place of employment is the state where the employee regularly reports to work, in this case, the location of the home terminal in Vermont. Reason A is not correct. Coverage is not based on travel miles but on the regular reporting location for work. Reason B is not correct. The negotiation site of the contract does not determine the principal place of employment under Vermont rules. Reason D is not correct. Vehicle registration location is irrelevant for determining principal place of employment. Question 11. An employee slipped at work on April 1st but did not notify the employer until April 20th. Under Vermont law, by what deadline must the employer file the first report of injury with the insurer? A. Within 14 calendar days following the date of injury. B. Within 7 calendar days after the employer receives notice. C. Within 30 calendar days of the first medical treatment. D. Within 60 calendar days after the injury occurrence. The correct answer is B. The correct answer is that the employer must file the first report of injury within 7 calendar days after receiving notice of the injury, per Vermont workers' compensation reporting requirements. Reason A is not correct. 14 days exceeds the 7-day statutory reporting requirement. Reason C is not correct. Reporting is triggered by notice, not the date of medical treatment, and must occur within 7 days. Reason D is not correct. 60 days far exceeds the 7-day obligation imposed on the employer. Question 12. Under Vermont workers' compensation law, how is the weekly temporary total disability benefit rate calculated, subject to statutory minimum and maximum benefit limits? A. 2/3 of the average weekly wage with no minimum or maximum limits. B. 2/3 of the average weekly wage, capped at the statutory maximum and floored at the statutory minimum. C. 50% of the average weekly wage, subject to the statutory minimum weekly benefit limit. D. 75% of the average weekly wage, subject to the statutory maximum weekly benefit limit. The correct answer is B. The correct answer is 2/3 of the average weekly wage, subject to both statutory minimum and maximum benefit limits, as defined in Vermont workers' compensation statutes for temporary total disability benefits. Reason A is not correct. This choice omits the required statutory minimum and maximum limits specified by Vermont law. Reason C is not correct. This rate uses an incorrect percentage and only addresses the statutory minimum limit, not both limits. Reason D is not correct. This rate applies an incorrect percentage and does not reflect the mandated 2/3 calculation. Question 13. Under Vermont workers' compensation law, how is the temporary partial disability benefit calculated when an employee returns to work earning less than the pre-injury wage? A. Pre-injury average weekly wage multiplied by 2/3. B. Pre-injury average weekly wage minus current weekly earnings multiplied by 1/2. C. Pre-injury average weekly wage minus current weekly earnings multiplied by 2/3. D. Current weekly earnings multiplied by 2/3. The correct answer is C. The correct calculation is the difference between the pre-injury average weekly wage and the employee's current weekly earnings, multiplied by 2/3, as specified in Vermont workers' compensation statutes for temporary partial disability benefits. Reason A is not correct. This option ignores the actual loss of earnings by using the full pre-injury wage as the base. Reason B is not correct. This choice applies an incorrect multiplier that does not align with Vermont law. Reason D is not correct. This option uses the wrong base by multiplying current earnings rather than the wage loss. Question 14. Which schedule is used under Vermont workers' compensation law to determine the number of weeks of benefits for permanent partial impairment? A. The advisory impairment schedule published by the National Council on Compensation Insurance for reference use. B. The statutory schedule listing the number of weeks of benefits per body part impairment. C. The impairment evaluation guidelines set forth in the American Medical Association's Guides to the Evaluation of Permanent Impairment. D. The benefit schedule applied to vocational rehabilitation services under workers' compensation law. The correct answer is B. Vermont statute prescribes a body part schedule that assigns a specific number of weeks of benefits for each type of permanent partial impairment, which governs benefit duration. Reason A is not correct. That schedule is only advisory and not binding under Vermont law. Reason C is not correct. The AMA guides determine the impairment rating, but do not establish the benefit duration schedule. Reason D is not correct. The vocational rehabilitation schedule is unrelated to permanent partial impairment benefits. Question 15. In Vermont workers' compensation cases, what is the primary purpose of a whole person impairment rating? A. To determine the scope, duration, and funding level of vocational rehabilitation services provided. B. To calculate both eligibility and benefit rate for temporary total or partial disability benefits. C. To quantify employer liability for potential third-party legal claims arising from workplace injury. D. To convert an impairment percentage into a corresponding number of weeks of permanent partial disability benefits. The correct answer is D. A whole person impairment rating converts the medical impairment percentage into the statutory number of weeks of permanent partial disability benefits, serving as the basis for benefit calculation in Vermont. Reason A is not correct. Vocational rehabilitation services are determined separately and not based on whole person impairment percentages. Reason B is not correct. Temporary disability benefits use different eligibility criteria and calculation methods. Reason C is not correct. whole person impairment ratings do not determine employer liability in third-party claims. Question 16. An adjuster reviews a claim for a worker with complete quadriplegia due to a spinal injury at the C4 level, requiring full-time personal assistance for all activities of daily living. Under Vermont workers' compensation law, which condition best meets the criteria for permanent total disability? A. Total amputation of both lower limbs at the hip. B. Complete loss of hearing in both ears with documented cochlear nerve damage. C. Complete sensory and motor paralysis below the C4 level requiring constant aid. D. Permanent loss of use of the dominant upper extremity. The correct answer is C. The correct answer is complete sensory and motor paralysis below the C4 level requiring constant aid because permanent total disability requires total and permanent incapacity necessitating continuous personal assistance for daily living activities under Vermont law. Reason A is not correct. Loss of both lower limbs impairs mobility but may allow functional independence with prosthetics or mobility aids and does not automatically require full-time personal assistance. Reason B is not correct. Severe hearing loss does not preclude engagement in gainful employment and does not meet the total disability threshold. Reason D is not correct. Loss of use of a single upper extremity, while significant, does not constitute total and permanent dependency for all daily activities. Question 17. After a workplace fatality, an investigator must determine eligible dependents under Vermont workers' compensation death benefit rules. Which individual would typically qualify as a dependent? A. An unmarried 18-year-old child attending college full-time and receiving room, board, and tuition from the deceased employee. B. A married 20-year-old child living with the deceased but receiving no financial support. C. A step-parent who received occasional gifts but had their own pension income. D. A grandchild in foster care who spent alternating weekends with the deceased employee. The correct answer is A. The correct answer is an unmarried 18-year-old full-time college student financially supported by the deceased employee because death benefit eligibility requires legal dependency, which includes full-time students under age 21 who are financially dependent. Reason B is not correct. A married child is disqualified regardless of living arrangement and lack of financial dependency under Vermont law. Reason C is not correct. Occasional gifts do not establish dependency when the individual has independent pension income. Reason D is not correct. Weekend visits do not establish the continuous financial dependency required for death benefits. Question 18. An insurer initially paid $8,000 for burial costs after a work-related fatality, but later adjusted the payment according to Section 632 of the Vermont Workers' Compensation Act. What is the maximum burial expense the insurer is required to reimburse? A. $6,000. B. $3,500. C. $8,000. D. $10,000. The correct answer is A. The correct answer is $6,000 because Section 632 caps burial reimbursements at that amount under Vermont workers' compensation law. Reason B is not correct. This underestimates the statutory limit and would leave eligible expenses unreimbursed. Reason C is not correct. Although matching the initial payment, it exceeds the statutory cap set by Section 632. Reason D is not correct. This amount greatly exceeds the maximum allowed by the Act. Question 19. Which of the following items is included in the general section of a standard workers' compensation and employer's liability policy? A. Employer's liability limit selection. B. Assigned classification codes and manual premium determination. C. Statutory schedule of benefits payable to injured workers. D. Aggregate limit for coverage in multiple states. The correct answer is B. The general section, Declarations of the policy, specifies the insured's classification codes and the basis for calculating manual premium, whereas liability limits and benefit schedules appear in other policy parts. Reason A is not correct. Liability limit selections are part of the employer's liability section, not the general section. Reason C is not correct. The statutory schedule of benefits appears under Part 1, not in the general section. Reason D is not correct. Aggregate limits for other states' coverage are included in the other state's endorsement, not the general section. Question 20. Under a workers' compensation and employer's liability policy, what is the primary obligation of the insurer under Part 1? A. Pay damages for suits brought by employees against the insured. B. Provide legal defense for insured and liability claims. C. Cover medical expenses without exercising subrogation rights. D. Pay benefits required by applicable workers' compensation law. The correct answer is D. Part 1. Workers' compensation obligates the insurer to pay benefits mandated by the state's workers' compensation statutes, whereas legal defense and damages for employee suits fall under employer's liability. Reason A is not correct. Damages for employee lawsuit claims are covered under employer's liability, Part 2, not Part 1. Reason B is not correct. Legal defense obligations are part of the employer's liability section, not the workers' compensation portion. Reason C is not correct. While medical expenses are covered, Part 1 includes subrogation rights. The key obligation is payment of statutory benefits. Question 21. Which set of employer's liability limits represents the standard minimum options offered in a workers' compensation and employer's liability policy? A. $50,000 per accident, $300,000 policy limit by disease, $50,000 per employee by disease. B. $500,000 per accident, $1 million policy limit by disease, $500,000 per employee by disease. C. $250,000 per accident, $1 million policy limit by disease, $250,000 per employee by disease. D. $100,000 per accident, $500,000 policy limit by disease, $100,000 per employee by disease. The correct answer is D. The standard employer's liability limit options in a WC and EL policy are expressed as three figures: 100,000 bodily injury per accident, 500,000 bodily injury by disease, policy limit, and 100,000 bodily injury by disease per employee. Reason A is not correct. Those lower limits do not meet the standard minimum employer's liability threshold. Reason B is not correct. These higher limits are optional increase limits, not the standard minimum option. Reason C is not correct. While higher options exist, they exceed the standard minimum limits typically offered. Question 22. A Vermont-based contractor holds a workers' compensation policy that includes the Part 3 other states' insurance endorsement. An electrician employed by the contractor normally works in Vermont, but travels occasionally to New Hampshire and Massachusetts. While on assignment in Massachusetts, the electrician suffers a compensable work injury. According to the Part 3 endorsement, which event triggers other states' coverage for this claim? A. The insurer receiving notice of the injury within the policy period. B. A state law mandating coverage in the jurisdiction where the injury happened. C. The injury occurring while temporarily performing duties in a state not listed in the policy declarations. D. The existence of a reciprocal coverage agreement between the home state and the injury state. The correct answer is C. The Part 3 endorsement is activated when an injury happens while the employee is working temporarily in a state not listed in the declarations. Other events like notice requirement or reciprocal agreements do not themselves create coverage under that endorsement. Reason A is not correct. Timely notice is required for handling claims but does not itself trigger the other state's endorsement. Reason B is not correct. A state law requiring coverage does not invoke the Part 3 endorsement. Coverage is based on where the injury occurs under the endorsement terms. Reason D is not correct. Reciprocal agreements do not affect the contractual trigger for Part 3 coverage, which is the location of the injury. Question 23. A Vermont manufacturer has a standard workers' compensation policy with territory defined as the United States of America, including its territories and possessions in Canada. In which of the following jurisdictions would an injury be excluded from coverage under that territory definition? A. Province of Ontario, Canada. B. Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. C. Mexico City, Mexico. D. Territory of Guam. The correct answer is C. The policy territory covers the U.S., its territories and possessions, and Canada. Mexico is not included, so an injury in Mexico City falls outside the defined territory. Reason A is not correct. Canada is explicitly included in the territory definition, so Ontario is covered. Reason B is not correct. Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory or possession, so it is included. Reason D is not correct. Guam is a U.S. territory and thus falls within the defined coverage territory. Question 24. Under Vermont law, what is the minimum required employer's liability limit for bodily injury by accident coverage per accident? A. $50,000. B. $100,000. C. $250,000. D. $500,000. The correct answer is B. This option is correct because Vermont statutes mandate an employer's liability limit of $100,000 for bodily injury by accident per accident. Reason A is not correct. This figure is too low. The statutory requirement exceeds $50,000 per accident. Reason C is not correct. This amount is higher than the per accident minimum. $250,000 is not the required limit. Reason D is not correct. This corresponds to the disease aggregate limit, not the per accident limit. Question 25. What is the statutory employer's liability bodily injury by disease aggregate limit under Vermont workers' compensation law? A. $100,000. B. $250,000. C. $1 million. D. $500,000. The correct answer is D. This option is correct because Vermont requires an employer's liability aggregate limit of $500,000 for bodily injury by disease. Reason A is not correct. This amount corresponds to the per accident limit, not the disease aggregate requirement. Reason B is not correct. This value is not a statutory threshold for disease aggregate under Vermont law. Reason C is not correct. This figure exceeds the mandated statutory limit and is not required. Question 26. A delivery driver injures his back while unloading packages at work after returning to his shift intoxicated. The employer seeks to deny workers compensation benefits based on the injury circumstances. Under the state's Workers' Compensation Act eliminating common law defenses, which defense may still bar compensation? A. Voluntary intoxication at the time of injury. B. Contributory negligence for failure to secure the load. C. Assumption of risk in performing known hazardous tasks. D. Fellow servant rule based on coworkers' negligence. The correct answer is A. This option is correct because the statute retains voluntary intoxication as a statutory exception, while all common law defenses, such as contributory negligence, assumption of risk, and the fellow servant rule, are abolished. Reason B is not correct. Contributory negligence has been removed by the Compensation Act and cannot be asserted as a defense. Reason C is not correct. Assumption of risk is abolished under the statute and cannot be used to deny benefits. Reason D is not correct. The fellow servant rule is eliminated by the Workers' Compensation Act, so it is not a valid defense. Question 27. An electrical technician files a workers' compensation claim for burns sustained at a client's site, and then sues a third-party contractor whose faulty wiring caused the accident. Under the state's workers' compensation law, which right does the insurer have against the third-party tortfeasor? A. Right to subrogation of benefits paid. B. Right to reduce future benefits owed to the employee. C. Right to require the employee to waive claims against the contractor. D. Right to recover attorney's fees from the employee's third-party award. The correct answer is A. This option is correct because workers' compensation statutes grant insurers subrogation rights to pursue negligent third parties and recover benefits already paid on the employee's claim. Reason B is not correct. Statutes do not allow insurers to offset or reduce future benefits based on third-party recovery. Reason C is not correct. An insurer cannot force an employee to waive a third-party suit as a condition of benefits. Reason D is not correct. Attorney's fees are not recoverable through subrogation under the statute. Question 28. Under Vermont workers' compensation regulations, within how many days after an employer obtains knowledge of a work-related injury or disablement, must the employer file the employer's first report of injury, Form 1, with the Department of Labor? A. 14 calendar days. B. 5 calendar days. C. 7 calendar days. D. 10 calendar days. The correct answer is C. The employer must file Form 1 within 7 calendar days of knowledge of the work-related injury or disablement with the Department of Labor under Vermont law. Reason A is not correct. Form 1 must be filed sooner than 14 calendar days. Reason B is not correct. The statutory window is longer than 5 calendar days. Reason D is not correct. The deadline is shorter than 10 calendar days. Question 29. Within how many days must an insurance carrier file the insurer's first report to the Department of Labor, Form 6, after accepting liability for a compensable claim under Vermont law? A. 21 calendar days. B. 7 calendar days. C. 10 calendar days. D. 14 calendar days. The correct answer is D. Vermont regulations require carriers to submit Form 6 within 14 days of accepting liability for a compensable workers' compensation claim. Reason A is not correct. 21 days exceeds the allowed time frame. Reason B is not correct. 7 days is shorter than the statutory requirement. Reason C is not correct. 10 days does not match the mandated filing period. Question 30. Under Vermont workers' compensation statutes, to preserve entitlement to benefits, within 6 months of the date of injury, an employee must A. Furnish wage loss documentation to the insurer. B. Submit a claim petition to the Workers' Compensation Division. C. Obtain a medical examination from a physician approved by the department. D. Provide the employer with written notice of the injury and resulting disability. The correct answer is D. Employees must notify their employer in writing of the work injury and resulting disability within 6 months to avoid forfeiture of workers' compensation benefits. Reason A is not correct. Wage loss documentation is not the notice required within 6 months. Reason B is not correct. Filing a claim petition within 6 months is not required to preserve benefits. Reason C is not correct. Medical examinations are governed by separate provisions. Question 31. Which describes the statutory requirement for an employer's posting of workers' compensation notice in Vermont? A. Include the notice within the employee handbook provided at orientation. B. Distribute the notice to employees within 10 days of hire and obtain signed acknowledgement. C. Post a Department of Labor-approved notice in a conspicuous location at each facility frequented by employees. D. Display the notice electronically on the company's intranet for remote access. The correct answer is C. Employers must display a department-approved workers' compensation notice physically in conspicuous locations at each facility where employees work under Vermont law. Reason A is not correct. Handbook inclusion does not satisfy the physical posting mandate. Reason B is not correct. There is no requirement for signed acknowledgement within 10 days. Reason D is not correct. Electronic display does not replace the required physical posting. Question 32. A physical therapist conducts the first compensable treatment for an injured worker on March 10th. According to Vermont workers' compensation regulations, by which date must the provider submit the medical provider report, Form 8, to the insurer? A. Within 10 days of the initial treatment. B. Within 45 days of the initial treatment. C. Within 30 days of the initial treatment. D. Within 15 days of the initial treatment. The correct answer is D. Vermont law requires medical providers to file Form 8 within 15 days of the first compensable treatment to ensure the insurer receives timely medical documentation. Reason A is not correct. Submitting within 10 days is too soon. The regulation specifies a 15-day window. Reason B is not correct. A 45-day period is well beyond the required submission timeline. Reason C is not correct. Allowing 30 days exceeds the statutory deadline and would be untimely. Question 33. According to Vermont workers' compensation law, to satisfy the substantial contributing cause test for injury compensability, the work-related activity must have done which of the following? A. Contributed more than a de minimis portion to the overall cause of the injury. B. Served as the proximate cause of the injury within 1 year of exposure. C. Represented the exclusive cause in the absence of non-work factors. D. Accounted for at least 50% of the causal factors. The correct answer is A. The substantial contributing cause test requires that the employment activity contribute more than a trivial de minimis portion to the injury. Reason B is not correct. It does not impose a 1-year proximate cause requirement. Reason C is not correct. It does not require the work activity to be the sole cause. Reason D is not correct. There is no fixed 50% threshold. More than trivial contribution suffices. Question 34. Under Vermont claims handling rules, an adjuster must attempt to obtain a recorded statement from an injured worker within which time frame after receiving notice of a lost time claim? A. Within 48 hours of receiving notice of a lost time claim. B. Within 10 days of the injury. C. Within 24 hours of receipt of claim notice. D. Within 72 hours of accident reporting. The correct answer is A. Regulations require that recorded statements be attempted within 48 hours of receiving notice of a lost time claim. Reason B is not correct. 10 days after injury is not specified by rule. Reason C is not correct. There is no 24-hour requirement. Reason D is not correct. The regulation specifies 48, not 72 hours. Question 35. An adjuster receives a workers' compensation claim for a wrist injury, but cannot obtain the claimant's medical records because the claimant refuses to sign the HIPAA authorization Form 7. What is the adjuster's next step to comply with record collection requirements? A. Explain that signing Form 7 is voluntary and proceed without medical records. B. Send the claimant a notice of deficiency and suspend claim payments until records arrive. C. Provide the claimant with a compliant Form 7 and explain its scope for medical record release. D. Request employer medical records directly from the treating physician. The correct answer is C. The adjuster must furnish a valid HIPAA authorization form, Form 7, and explain what medical information it covers to secure claimant permission for records release. Reason A is not correct. Proceeding without records violates discovery requirements and hinders compensability determination. Reason B is not correct. Suspending benefits for missing authorization is improper. Deficiency notices correct forms, not suspend payments. Reason D is not correct. Physicians will not release claimant records without proper authorization regardless of employer request. Question 36. A claimant with multiple orthopedic injuries is not improving under standard treatment. Which action best facilitates a certified medical consultant CMC review for complex injury management? A. File a request for an independent medical review with the Workers' Compensation Board. B. Refer the file to the claims manager for complex medical case designation. C. Schedule the claimant for a panel QME examination. D. Authorize additional physical therapy sessions before a CMC review. The correct answer is B. Designating the case as a complex medical case initiates a CMC review, ensuring specialized assessment of multiple orthopedic injury management strategies. Reason A is not correct. An independent review differs from a CMC. CMC requires internal complex case designation first. Reason C is not correct. A panel QME is for disputes, not for coordinating complex multidisciplinary reviews by a CMC. Reason D is not correct. Additional therapy does not substitute for a specialized CMC evaluation of complex injuries. Question 37. A worker reports renewed low back pain after a return to work period following an earlier back injury. The adjuster must distinguish aggravation from recurrence. Which evidence most reliably indicates aggravation? A. Medical records showing continuous symptoms throughout work activities. B. Previous imaging demonstrating healed structures, followed by new tear on repeat MRI. C. Claimant testimony that pain returned without new work incident. D. A gap in treatment records with increased pain upon physical exertion. The correct answer is B. New imaging evidence of a fresh tear after documented healing demonstrates aggravation of the prior injury rather than mere recurrence of old symptoms. Reason A is not correct. Continuous symptoms may indicate chronic issues, not a distinct aggravation event. Reason C is not correct. Return of pain without incident suggests recurrence, not necessarily aggravation of healed tissue. Reason D is not correct. A treatment gap with exertion pain is inconclusive without objective imaging of new pathology. Question 38. A subcontractor injured on the employer's site claims wage replacement benefits. To verify employment status, which document provides the clearest evidence of control over work performance? A. Written subcontract agreement outlining deliverables and deadlines. B. U-9 tax form showing independent contractor status. C. Site safety log recording daily supervisor instructions. D. Proof of the subcontractor's own liability insurance policy. The correct answer is C. A site safety log documenting daily supervisor instructions demonstrates the employer's actual control over the worker's performance, indicating an employment relationship. Reason A is not correct. A written contract does not establish day-to-day control over how work is performed. Reason B is not correct. Tax classification alone is not determinative of the control factor in employment tests. Reason D is not correct. Having insurance reflects business status, not the level of employer control over work. Question 39. A claimant reports an unwitnessed fall in a dimly lit warehouse. To corroborate the incident, which interview strategy best ensures objective information from potential witnesses? A. Conduct group interviews to observe consistency in statements. B. Interview witnesses separately using open-ended questions about conditions. C. Request signed affidavits summarizing each witness's version. D. Provide leading questions to confirm the claimant's account. The correct answer is B. Separately interviewing witnesses with open-ended questions minimizes suggestion bias and encourages independent, detailed recollection of environmental conditions. Reason A is not correct. Group interviews risk conformity pressure and can produce rehearsed statements. Reason C is not correct, and affidavits may reflect coached narratives rather than spontaneous recollection. Reason D is not correct. Leading questions can implant bias and undermine credibility of witness testimony. Question 40. Under Vermont's Rule 40 medical fee schedule structure, what is the primary purpose of the conversion factor in calculating reimbursement for CPT-coded physician services? A. To adjust the relative value unit to account for regional cost differences. B. To establish a standard monetary value for commonly used drug codes. C. To multiply the weighted relative value unit and geographic practice cost index product to determine a dollar payment. D. To normalize the geographic practice cost index to national average levels. The correct answer is C. The conversion factor serves as the multiplier that, when applied to the product of the relative value unit and geographic practice cost index, yields the reimbursable dollar amount under the Rule 40 fee schedule. Reason A is not correct. It is the geographic practice cost index that adjusts for regional cost differences, not the conversion factor. Reason B is not correct. Conversion factors are not used to assign standard monetary values specifically to drug codes. Reason D is not correct. The conversion factor does not alter the geographic practice cost index to national levels. Question 41. As the claims adjuster, what is the next required action to ensure compliance with Vermont's preferred provider network rules? A. Inform the employee in writing of the network provider list and send a copy within 5 business days. B. Process all non-network provider bills at the network fee schedule without notifying the employee. C. Deny any medical bills from non-network providers until the employee returns to a network provider. D. Obtain commissioner approval before referring the employee to any network specialist. The correct answer is A. The correct answer is to inform the employee in writing of the network provider list and send a copy within 5 business days, because Vermont law requires timely notice of preferred provider network options to injured workers prior to any non-network treatment. Reason B is not correct. Processing non-network bills at the network rate without notifying the employee fails to meet the statutory notice requirement. Reason C is not correct. Denying non-network bills ignores the obligation to inform and may delay necessary treatment. Reason D is not correct. Commissioner approval is not required for referrals within an approved network. Question 42. Which step should the adjuster take next to comply with Vermont's change of physician procedure? A. Inform the worker that one change is permitted and send the official change of physician form within 5 business days. B. Forward the request to the Department of Labor within 7 days for regulatory approval. C. Provide a list of 3 local specialists and allow the worker to make a selection. D. Require the worker to submit a detailed medical justification for the physician change before processing. The correct answer is A. The correct answer is to inform the worker that one change is permitted and send the official change of physician form within 5 business days, because Vermont allows one voluntary physician change and mandates timely provision of the standardized form. Reason B is not correct. Regulatory approval is unnecessary. The adjuster must handle the form directly. Reason C is not correct. Simply providing a list of specialists without the official form does not satisfy statutory requirements. Reason D is not correct. Requiring a detailed medical justification exceeds procedural requirements for a voluntary change. Question 43. What must the adjuster verify to appropriately pre-authorize this MRI request under Vermont's medical management rules? A. Confirmation that conservative treatment has been attempted for at least 3 weeks and documentation of functional impairment. B. That the MRI will be performed at a non-network facility since network radiologists are unavailable. C. Only the physician's signature since pre-authorization is not required after 30 days. D. Advance written approval from the employer before scheduling the MRI. The correct answer is A. The correct answer is to verify that conservative treatment has been attempted for at least 3 weeks and that there is documentation of functional impairment because Vermont requires evidence of non-responsive conservative care before authorizing advanced imaging. Reason B is not correct. Performing at a non-network facility does not waive clinical criteria for imaging approval. Reason C is not correct. Pre-authorization is required regardless of the time elapsed since injury. Reason D is not correct. Employer approval alone does not substitute for medical necessity documentation. Question 44. Under Vermont workers' compensation regulations, an insurer must establish an indemnity reserve sufficient to cover wage loss benefits for the maximum statutory benefit period. What is the maximum benefit duration for temporary total disability in weeks? A. 104. B. 156. C. 312. D. 260. The correct answer is D. The correct answer is that Vermont's maximum temporary total disability benefit period is 260 weeks, so reserves must cover that duration. Reason A is not correct. This duration reflects common temporary total limits in other jurisdictions, but is shorter than Vermont's statutory maximum. Reason B is not correct. This figure is not specified in Vermont regulations for maximum benefit duration. Reason C is not correct. This higher duration applies to certain impairment categories, but not the maximum statutory period for temporary total disability. Question 45. According to Vermont workers' compensation regulations, what annual discount rate must be used when calculating the present value of future medical costs for catastrophic injury claims? A. 0%. B. 3%. C. 1%. D. 5%. The correct answer is C. The correct answer is that Vermont mandates a 1% annual discount rate when calculating present value of future medical costs in catastrophic injury cases. Reason A is not correct. A 0% rate would ignore the time value of money, contrary to regulatory requirements. Reason B is not correct. A 3% rate often corresponds to cost inflation assumptions, not the mandated discount rate. Reason D is not correct. A 5% rate exceeds the prescribed regulatory discount for medical reserves in Vermont. Question 46. An insurer is establishing reserves for a workers' compensation claim after a claimant's deposition. Which expense would be classified as an allocated loss adjustment expense, ALAE, for this specific claim? A. Court reporter fees for the claimant's deposition transcript. B. Salaries of claims examiners managing multiple open claims. C. Postal service costs for mailings from the claims office. D. Training expenses for new claim department staff. The correct answer is A. Court reporter fees are incurred specifically for this claim and thus are allocated loss adjustment expenses directly tied to the handling of this case. Reason B is not correct. Examiners' salaries are general overhead costs spread across all claims, making them unallocated expenses. Reason C is not correct. Postal costs support overall departmental operations rather than a single claim and are unallocated. Reason D is not correct. Staff training benefits the entire claims department and is treated as an unallocated overhead expense. Question 47. Under Vermont workers' compensation regulations, at what minimum permanent impairment rating is an injured worker eligible for vocational rehabilitation services? A. Permanent impairment rating of 5% of the body as a whole. B. Inability to return to work within 90 days after injury. C. Loss of 20% of pre-injury wage earning capacity. D. Permanent impairment rating of 10% of the body as a whole. The correct answer is D. The correct answer is that Vermont law mandates eligibility for vocational rehabilitation services when an injured worker has a permanent impairment rating of at least 10% of the body as a whole. Other thresholds, such as wage loss or duration of disability, do not by themselves trigger the requirement for vocational rehabilitation under the statute. Reason A is not correct. An impairment rating of 5% falls below the statutory threshold and does not automatically qualify a worker for vocational rehabilitation. Reason B is not correct. The statute does not base vocational rehabilitation eligibility solely on duration of disability, such as a 90-day absence. Reason C is not correct. While a 20% wage loss may indicate need for services, the statute specifically uses the impairment rating as the eligibility measure. Question 48. An adjuster at Green Maple Construction determines that an injured employee cannot return to their date of injury position and requires vocational rehabilitation services. According to Vermont's Form VR1 referral process, which action must the adjuster take next? A. Provide the claimant with a copy of the completed Form VR1 within 5 business days, and file the original with the Vermont Department of Labor's Vocational Rehabilitation Unit. B. Send the completed Form VR1 to the Department of Labor and to a certified rehabilitation consultant within 10 business days, then schedule an initial evaluation. C. Submit the completed Form VR1 to the Vermont Department of Labor's Vocational Rehabilitation Unit and furnish a copy to the claimant within 3 business days of determining the need. D. File the completed Form VR1 with the Department of Financial Regulation and notify the employer within 7 calendar days of the referral decision. The correct answer is A. This option correctly describes the requirement to file the original VR1 form with the Vermont Department of Labor's Vocational Rehabilitation Unit and to provide a copy to the claimant within 5 business days of determining the need for vocational rehabilitation services, ensuring compliance with Vermont's referral timeline and documentation rules. Reason B is not correct. The process does not require sending the form directly to a rehabilitation consultant within 10 business days. The form must be filed with the Department of Labor first. Reason C is not correct. This option specifies a 3 business day window, which is shorter than the required 5 business day period for filing and notifying the claimant. Reason D is not correct. The form must be filed with the Department of Labor's Vocational Rehabilitation Unit rather than the Department of Financial Regulation, and the 7-day timeline is incorrect. Question 49. In Vermont's workers' compensation litigation process, which statement correctly distinguishes an informal conference from a formal hearing? A. They are both non-binding methods of conflict resolution, but informal conferences employ a commissioner to explore settlement, while formal hearings result in a binding decision. B. Informal conferences proceed without oath or formal transcript and aim to facilitate settlement. Formal hearings are adjudicatory, use sworn testimony, and produce a transcribed record. C. Informal conferences allow for evidentiary discovery and cross-examination, but yield no recommended decisions. Formal hearings limit discovery and admit only documentary evidence. D. They both produce official recommended decisions subject to appeal, but formal hearings require a neutral third-party mediator, and informal conferences do not. The correct answer is B. The correct answer is that informal conferences are non-binding, settlement-focused meetings held without sworn testimony or transcript, whereas formal hearings are adjudicatory proceedings requiring oath-administered testimony and a transcribed record. Reason A is not correct. This is incorrect because formal hearings result in recommended decisions that guide final awards, not merely binding decisions in a mediation sense. Reason C is not correct. This is incorrect because informal conferences do not permit formal discovery or cross-examination. Those occur in formal hearings. Reason D is not correct. This is incorrect because informal conferences do not produce recommended decisions, and formal hearings do not involve a separate mediator role. Question 50. An injured worker receives a denial letter dated May 1st that the Department of Labor actually receives on May 4th. Under Vermont workers' compensation rules, by what date must the worker file a request for an administrative law judge hearing? A. May 31st. B, June cubed. C, June 1st. D, June 30th. The correct answer is B. Hearing requests must be filed within 30 calendar days of receipt of a denial notice. Counting 30 days from May 4th yields June cubed. Reason A is not correct. This date counts 30 days from the denial letter date rather than from the receipt date. Reason C is not correct. This date reflects starting the count before the department actually received the notice. Reason D is not correct. This date uses a 60-day time frame instead of the required 30-day period. Enjoyed this practice test? Tap like, hit subscribe, and share it with a classmate. Got a question we should tweak? Comment below, we read them all. Find full practice exam books in the description or at ExamPrep.School.